Amalia and Joseph have been married for 8 years. When they first met, their connection seemed strong, and they believed their marriage would last a lifetime. However, over the years, their relationship started to deteriorate. Joseph, a dedicated police officer, spent most of his time at work, leaving Amalia feeling isolated. His long hours and commitment to his career took priority over their marriage. Amalia found herself spending more and more time alone, waiting for Joseph to come home, only to realize that even when he was physically present, he was emotionally distant. Amalia started noticing that Joseph no longer engaged with her like he used to. Their conversations had become short and routine, mostly focused on logistics, household tasks, or Joseph's job. The emotional bond they once had was fading. Amalia began to feel as if her needs and desires were no longer important to Joseph. He had stopped asking about her day, her feelings, and her dreams. She felt forgotten. The emotional disconnect weighed heavily on Amalia. While Joseph continued to pour himself into his work, she felt the growing distance between them. She longed for meaningful conversations, affection, and intimacy, but Joseph seemed oblivious to her concerns. When she tried to bring up her feelings, he often dismissed them, either too tired from work or unwilling to address the issue. This constant rejection deepened Amalia's sense of abandonment. Amalia also noticed how much Joseph had changed over the years. He had become more rigid and distant. His once carefree and loving nature was now replaced by a stern, no-nonsense attitude, which he attributed to the stresses of his job. Joseph often talked about how his job required him to keep his emotions in check, but Amalia felt that this emotional detachment had seeped into their personal life as well. Amalia's frustration and sadness grew. She tried to immerse herself in hobbies and work, but the emptiness lingered. Every day felt like she was living with a stranger. She missed the days when they could laugh together, share their worries, and support each other. While Joseph remained unaware of the depth of Amalia's unhappiness, she began to question the future of their marriage. She wondered if Joseph even cared anymore, or if his dedication to his career had completely overtaken his love for her. She knew that she couldn't go on like this forever, living in a marriage where her emotional needs were neglected. Amalia's thoughts turned inward. She began to consider what her life could look like outside of her marriage. She had been independent before Joseph, but 8 years of marriage had changed her. She wasn't sure if she could walk away, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the fact that she felt trapped in a relationship that was slowly suffocating her. It was at one of the annual police department events that Amalia first met Matthew Davis, Joseph's superior officer. The event was a typical formal gathering organized to honor the efforts of law enforcement officers and to strengthen connections within the department. Amalia attended the event alongside Joseph, though their interactions had been minimal. She felt out of place among the bustling crowd, surrounded by police officers and their families who seemed far more connected and engaged than she and Joseph. As the evening progressed, Amalia found herself standing alone near one of the tables, quietly observing the interactions around her. It was at that moment that Matthew approached her. He was charismatic, tall, and exuded confidence in a way that immediately caught Amalia's attention. Unlike the others at the event, Matthew seemed to notice her isolation, and he wasted no time in striking up a conversation. "Amalia, right? Joseph's wife?" Matthew said with a warm smile, extending his hand for a handshake. Amalia was slightly taken aback by the directness, but felt a sense of relief that someone had reached out to her. She smiled politely and nodded. "Yes, that's right. And you must be Matthew? Joseph speaks highly of you." Matthew laughed lightly, brushing off the compliment with a casual wave of his hand. "I'm sure he does," he said with a hint of irony. "But enough about work. How are you enjoying the event?" Amalia hesitated, not wanting to reveal her discomfort but also feeling no need to lie. "It's fine. I don't really know many people here, though." Matthew seemed to sense her unease and offered a reassuring look. "I can understand that. These events can feel pretty formal and stiff, but they're also a good way to meet people. Let me introduce you to a few folks, unless, of course, you'd rather escape for some fresh air, he suggested, smiling. Amalia was surprised by his suggestion, but also intrigued. Unlike the formal and distant attitude she had grown accustomed to in her interactions with Joseph's colleagues, Matthew's approach was personal and engaging. There was an energy to him that she hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. "I think I'll take you up on that offer for fresh air," Amalia replied, smiling back at him. The two made their way outside, away from the noise of the event. For the first time in what felt like years, Amalia found herself in a conversation that wasn't weighed down by obligation or formality. Matthew asked her about her life, her interests, and her experiences, genuinely listening to her responses. The attention he gave her was something she hadn't felt from Joseph in a long time, and she couldn't help but feel drawn to Matthew. Over the next few weeks, Amalia and Matthew crossed paths more frequently. Whether it was at police department gatherings or casual encounters around town, their conversations continued to grow deeper and more personal. Each time they spoke, Amalia felt a growing sense of connection with Matthew, a connection she hadn't felt with Joseph in years. Matthew's confidence and charm made it easy for Amalia to open up to him. He made her feel seen, valued, and understood, things she had been craving for so long in her marriage. He asked about her thoughts, her dreams, and her frustrations, and he listened without judgment. Amalia found herself sharing more with Matthew than she had ever shared with anyone outside of her marriage. Amalia knew that her growing closeness with Matthew was crossing a line, but she couldn't help herself. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized how deeply unsatisfied she was in her marriage. Matthew, with his confidence and attentiveness, represented everything that was missing in her life with Joseph. The affection she had once hoped to receive from her husband now seemed impossible. But with Matthew, it felt within reach. It was an ordinary afternoon when Amalia found herself near the police precinct, running errands in town. She hadn't expected to see Matthew there, but as she walked past the entrance, their paths crossed unexpectedly. Matthew greeted her with the same warm, confident smile she had grown used to, and they exchanged casual pleasantries. The encounter seemed innocuous at first, but as they talked, Matthew noticed that Amalia didn't have her car with her. "Let me give you a ride," he offered, glancing towards his car parked nearby. "I was just about to head out, and it's no trouble at all." Amalia hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. The idea of spending a bit more time with Matthew, even in such a casual setting, was appealing. She climbed into the passenger seat, and as they drove away from the precinct, the conversation flowed easily. They talked about everything and nothing, mundane topics like the weather, their shared disdain for traffic, and updates on recent police events. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension, a connection that had been building over the past few weeks. As the drive continued, the tone of their conversation shifted. Matthew became quieter, more thoughtful, and Amalia could sense that something was on his mind. Finally, after a few moments of silence, Matthew spoke up. "Amalia, there's something I've been meaning to say," he began, his voice steady but serious. "I didn't expect this to happen, and I know it might not be what you want to hear, but I can't stop thinking about you." Amalia's heart raced. She turned to look at Matthew, unsure of how to respond. She had felt the same pull towards him, but hearing him admit it out loud made it real in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Matthew continued, sensing her hesitation. "I know you're married, and I'm not trying to complicate things for you. But I feel like we've built something between us, and I just needed you to know how I feel." Amalia remained silent, processing his words. She knew that what Matthew was saying was true. The connection they shared had been growing stronger, and no matter how much she tried to deny it, she couldn't ignore her own feelings any longer. Her marriage with Joseph was falling apart, and Matthew had filled a void in her life that had been empty for far too long. After a long pause, Amalia finally spoke. "I've been feeling the same way," she admitted softly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I didn't expect this either, but I can't deny it anymore." For a moment, the car was filled with the weight of their confession. They both knew what this meant. This was no longer just harmless conversation. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Matthew pulled the car over to a quiet side street and turned to face Amalia fully. "I don't want to pressure you into anything," he said. "But if you feel the same way, maybe we could meet outside of all this. Outside of work. Outside of everything else." Amalia nodded, her mind racing with the implications of what they were about to do. She knew that meeting Matthew outside of work meant stepping into dangerous territory, but at that moment, it felt like the only choice. She agreed, and they set a time and place for their first secret meeting. That night, Amalia lay awake in bed beside Joseph, her mind filled with thoughts of Matthew. Guilt gnawed at her, but so did a sense of excitement and freedom that she hadn't felt in years. She had always been the dutiful wife, standing by Joseph despite the growing emotional distance between them. But now she found herself drawn into something new, something she couldn't control. Their first meeting outside of work was discreet, held at a small cafe in a part of town where neither of them would be recognized. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation, and they spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing pieces of themselves that they hadn't shared with anyone else. As the night wore on, their conversations grew more intimate, and the emotional connection between them deepened. Before long, their relationship crossed from emotional to physical. What had started as innocent encounters quickly evolved into a full-blown affair. Amalia was caught up in the thrill of it all. Matthew made her feel alive in a way that Joseph hadn't for years. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The more time she spent with Matthew, the more she felt like she was reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost in her marriage. But as the affair progressed, Amalia began to realize just how risky the situation had become. She went to great lengths to hide her relationship with Matthew from Joseph, coming up with excuses for her absences, and guarding her phone closely to ensure that no messages or calls from Matthew were discovered. Every moment spent with Matthew brought with it a heightened sense of fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of the consequences. Fear of what would happen if the truth came out. Amalia knew that she was in over her head. The affair had started as a way to escape the loneliness and emotional emptiness she felt in her marriage, but now it was spiraling out of control. The more she tried to balance her double life, the more she felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. Joseph had always trusted Amalia, but over the past few months, he started to notice subtle changes in her behavior. The once predictable patterns of her daily life had shifted. She began leaving the house more frequently, often with vague explanations about where she was going or why she was running late. What initially seemed like innocent errands or social events started to form a pattern that Joseph couldn't ignore. Amalia had always been honest with Joseph, or so he believed. But now, her answers seemed rehearsed, her demeanor slightly off. Joseph, being a police officer, was trained to recognize the smallest of inconsistencies, and the more he paid attention, the more he noticed. Her phone was constantly by her side, a device she previously left around the house without a second thought. When he asked her about her sudden busy schedule, her responses felt incomplete, as if she was withholding something. It wasn't long before Joseph's professional instincts took over. He tried to shake off his suspicions at first, convincing himself that his demanding job had simply made him paranoid. But the more he observed, the more he realized that something wasn't right. Amalia was becoming increasingly distant, emotionally and physically. Her once affectionate nature had turned cold, and Joseph began to feel as if he was living with a stranger. Determined to uncover the truth, Joseph decided to use the skills he had honed throughout his career. He began discreetly tracking Amalia's movements, taking note of her departure times, her destinations, and the frequency of her absences. He didn't want to believe that his wife was being unfaithful, but the mounting evidence was hard to ignore. Joseph started following her without her knowledge. He waited for opportunities when she left the house unexpectedly, claiming to run errands or meet friends. He made sure to stay out of sight, following her car from a distance, blending into the flow of traffic, as he had done countless times in his police work. His heart raced as he watched her pull into unfamiliar locations, places where she had no business being, as far as he knew. It didn't take long for Joseph to gather enough information to confirm his worst fears. One afternoon, after trailing Amalia for nearly an hour, He watched as she arrived at a small, out-of-the-way cafe. His stomach dropped as he saw Matthew Davis, his superior, walk in shortly after her. They sat together at a table in the back, and Joseph observed them through the window. The casual touches, the way they leaned in to speak in hushed tones, and the smiles exchanged between them were undeniable. Joseph felt the cold sting of betrayal as he realized what had been happening behind his back. The confirmation that Amalia was having an affair with Matthew was devastating. It wasn't just any man. It was someone Joseph worked with, someone he had respected. The betrayal was twofold, and it made the situation all the more unbearable. Joseph's mind raced as he grappled with the reality of what he had uncovered. His marriage, his trust in Amalia, and his professional relationship with Matthew were all shattered in an instant. Joseph's first instinct was to confront Amalia immediately, to storm into the cafe and demand answers. But something held him back. As much as he wanted to lash out, he knew that he needed to approach the situation carefully. If he acted impulsively, it could backfire, both personally and professionally. He needed to gather more information, to ensure that when the time came for confrontation, he would have the upper hand. In the days that followed, Joseph continued to monitor Amalia's movements. He took note of every time she left the house, every place she went, and every interaction she had with Matthew. He knew that he was crossing a line by following his wife, but he justified it by telling himself that he needed to protect his own interests. The more he watched, the more he felt his anger grow. Amalia was no longer just his wife. She had become someone he didn't recognize, someone who had betrayed his trust in the most intimate way. Eventually, Joseph couldn't hold back any longer. He had all the evidence he needed, and the weight of the secret was too much to bear. He knew he had to confront Amalia and Matthew, to bring everything into the open and face the consequences of their actions. It was a cold evening when Joseph finally decided he couldn't take it any longer. He had been following Amalia closely for weeks, and tonight he was determined to put an end to the deception once and for all. His heart pounded as he parked his car a few streets away from the address he had tracked her to. A small house on the outskirts of town, far from the places she typically frequented. As he approached the house, Joseph's mind raced with emotions: anger, betrayal, and a deep, aching sadness. He had known about the affair for some time, but the reality of seeing it play out in front of him, time and time again, had pushed him to the breaking point. Tonight, he wasn't just a bystander. Tonight, he would confront Amalia and Matthew face to face. Joseph stayed in the shadows as he reached the house, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. From the dimly lit window, he could see the silhouettes of Amalia and Matthew inside. They were sitting close together, talking, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Joseph's fists clenched at his sides as he watched them, his rage building with every second. He couldn't wait any longer. Without hesitation, Joseph approached the front door and knocked, his hand shaking slightly. Inside, Amalia and Matthew exchanged confused looks. They hadn't been expecting anyone. Amalia's heart skipped a beat as she wondered who it could be at this late hour. When she opened the door, her face turned pale as she came face to face with Joseph. "Joseph," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Joseph pushed past her without saying a word, his eyes locked on Matthew, who was still sitting in the living room. Matthew stood up, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. He knew exactly why Joseph was there, and it wasn't going to end well. "Amalia, get out of the way," Joseph said, his voice cold and steady. "This is between me and him." Amalia tried to speak, tried to diffuse the situation, but the tension in the room was palpable. Joseph's anger was like a ticking time bomb, and nothing she said could stop it. She stepped aside, her heart pounding as she watched the two men face each other. "Joseph, let's talk about this," Matthew said cautiously, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "We don't need to do this here. Not like this." But Joseph wasn't interested in talking. The betrayal, the months of lies, the humiliation. It was all too much. He lunged at Matthew, shoving him hard against the wall. Amalia screamed, rushing forward to try and pull Joseph back, but he was too strong, too consumed by rage to stop. The two men struggled, their voices rising as the confrontation escalated. Matthew tried to push Joseph off, but Joseph had the advantage of strength and determination. The fight quickly became physical, with punches being thrown and furniture knocked over in the chaos. Amalia stood frozen, terrified, unsure of what to do. In the midst of the struggle, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Matthew, in an attempt to defend himself, reached for the gun he kept in his jacket. He had never intended to use it, but in the heat of the moment, his instincts took over. As he pulled the gun from his jacket, it slipped from his hand, falling to the floor with a loud thud. Both men froze for a split second, their eyes locked on the weapon lying between them. Joseph, acting on pure adrenaline, reached for it, but so did Matthew. In the scuffle that followed, the gun went off. The deafening sound of the gunshot echoed through the small house. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. Joseph staggered backward, his face a mask of shock as he clutched his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt as he stumbled and fell to the floor. Amalia screamed again, rushing to Joseph's side, but it was too late. The bullet had struck him in the heart, and within seconds, Joseph was gone. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, the life drained from them. Matthew stood frozen, his hands shaking as he stared at the gun in his hand. He hadn't meant for this to happen. None of them had. The affair, the lies, the deception. It had all spiraled out of control, and now it had ended in tragedy. Matthew dropped the gun, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed onto the floor, his head in his hands. Amalia knelt beside Joseph's body, sobbing uncontrollably. She couldn't believe what had just happened. In her mind, she replayed the last few months, the stolen moments, the secret meetings, the growing distance between her and Joseph. She had never imagined that it would come to this. As the reality of the situation set in, Amalia and Matthew both knew that there was no going back. Their secret affair had destroyed not only Joseph's life, but theirs as well. The death of Joseph set off a series of events that none of them had anticipated. Within hours of the shooting, the police arrived at the scene. The sight of their colleague lying lifeless on the floor stunned the responding officers. Joseph's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for Amalia and Matthew. It was a shock to the entire police department. Matthew was immediately taken into custody, his face pale and his demeanor broken. As he sat in the back of the police car, handcuffed, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. He knew that Joseph's death had been an accident, but that wouldn't matter in the eyes of the law. He had killed a fellow officer, and there was no escaping the consequences of that. The police launched an official investigation, and as the details of the night emerged, Matthew was formally charged with involuntary manslaughter. The fact that the gun used in the incident was Matthew's service weapon only made the situation worse. The investigators scrutinized every aspect of the case, including Matthew's role as Joseph's superior and the affair that had led to the deadly confrontation. Amalia, meanwhile, found herself caught in the middle of the investigation. She was interviewed extensively by the police, forced to relive the events of that night over and over again. Each time she recounted the story, the reality of Joseph's death hit her harder. The guilt she felt was overwhelming. She knew that if it weren't for her affair with Matthew, Joseph would still be alive. The knowledge that her actions had contributed to the tragedy weighed heavily on her, but she also knew she had to cooperate with the investigation. Amalia became a key witness in the case against Matthew. Her testimony was crucial in establishing the timeline of events leading up to Joseph's death, as well as the nature of her relationship with Matthew. It wasn't easy for her to face the courtroom, where she had to speak openly about the affair and the fatal confrontation. Each day of the trial felt like an endless cycle of pain and regret. The trial itself was a drawn-out process that lasted several months. Both the prosecution and defense built their cases around the circumstances of the shooting, but the fact that Matthew had used his service weapon became a focal point. The prosecution argued that, as a police officer, Matthew had a responsibility to handle his firearm with the utmost care, and the fact that it had been drawn in a moment of personal conflict only deepened his culpability. They emphasized that even though the shooting was accidental, Matthew's actions had directly led to Joseph's death. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Matthew had never intended to kill Joseph. They painted the confrontation as a heated, tragic accident, a moment of uncontrolled chaos that had spiraled out of control. They tried to cast doubt on whether Matthew had acted recklessly, suggesting that it was Joseph's aggression that had escalated the situation. But the presence of Matthew's service weapon remained a significant hurdle in their case. Matthew, for his part, sat silently through most of the trial, his expression unreadable. He knew that his fate rested in the hands of the jury, and despite his lawyer's efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he would be found guilty. The fact that he had drawn his service weapon in a personal altercation was impossible to overlook. In the final days of the trial, both sides presented their closing arguments. The prosecution emphasized the recklessness of Matthew's actions, while the defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that Matthew had already paid a heavy price for his mistakes. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the evidence carefully. When the verdict was finally delivered, Matthew stood with his lawyer, awaiting the decision. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the jury's findings. Matthew was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The sentence was harsh, 15 years in a maximum security prison. The fact that Matthew had used his service weapon, combined with the nature of the incident, led the judge to impose a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime. Amalia sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, tears streaming down her face. It was over. The trial, the investigation, the months of uncertainty, they had all come to an end. But the conclusion offered no relief, no sense of closure. Joseph was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Matthew's life was now in ruins, and Amalia's own future was uncertain. As Matthew was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Amalia felt the full weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. What had started as a secret affair had ended in death, prison, and irreparable loss. There was no going back, no undoing the choices that had led to that fateful night.